In Maple Grove, Minnesota, a detective's badge fooled 47 elderly residents this winter. Only 46 survived to tell their tale. Welcome to the Nightmare Maestro's archive, where tonight's story will make you question every uniform that asks for your trust. The residents of Pine Valley Estates took pride in their vigilance. In a community where the average age hovered around 70, watching out for each other wasn't just neighborly, it was survival. Margaret Wheeler, 73, maintained her post by the bay window each morning, cataloging every visitor with the same meticulous attention she'd given to books during her 30 years as head librarian. The unmarked police car that cruised past her window that crisp February morning triggered something in her institutional memory. Its midnight blue paint carried an impossible gleam, untouched by the salt and slush that plagued Minnesota winters. The emergency light bar seemed slightly askew, its profile somehow wrong against the vehicle's sleek lines. Even the way it moved, too slow, too deliberate, felt like a predator's stalk rather than a protector's patrol. The man who emerged confirmed Margaret's unease. His dark suit fit too well for a civil servant's salary, every crease sharp enough to draw blood. His badge caught the morning sun as he straightened his tie, the flash of gold almost theatrical in its timing. Margaret watched him consult a small leather notebook, his movements choreographed with unsettling precision. His first stop was the Henderson house across the street. Eleanor Henderson, still raw from losing her husband of 46 years just 3 months ago, would be easy prey for any official-looking visitor. Through her window, Margaret observed their interaction with growing concern. The man's posture shifted subtly as Eleanor opened her door, his shoulders softening, head tilting in practiced sympathy, right hand staying conspicuously near his badge. Eleanor's body language transformed in response, her initial wariness melting into that particular vulnerability that comes from believing help has finally arrived. The entire interaction lasted exactly 17 minutes. Margaret knew because she timed it, just as she would time every subsequent visit he made to her neighbors. Something about his efficiency raised the fine hairs on her neck, the same instinct that had once helped her catch students attempting to smuggle books from her library. As the man returned to his car, Margaret noticed something else. Unlike every other police vehicle she'd ever seen, this one's wheels were immaculate, as if it had been lifted over the winter roads rather than driven on them. Detective James Morrison constructed his identity with the same precision a spider uses to build its web. His story, when shared over teacups and coffee mugs throughout Pine Valley Estates, seemed specifically crafted to prey on the community's deepest fears. A sophisticated ring of burglars had been targeting elderly residents in nearby communities, he explained. They weren't your typical smash-and-grab criminals. These perpetrators studied their victims for weeks, learning routines, identifying valuables, and exploiting vulnerabilities. His badge would appear with practiced timing, displayed just long enough to register authority, but too briefly for careful inspection. The golden shield caught the light at perfect angles, its surface unmarred by the wear that years of real police work would inflict. His knowledge of police procedures was encyclopedic, delivered with the smooth confidence of someone who had studied rather than lived the role. Morrison's technique was a masterclass in manipulation. He would begin each visit with a story about a recent victim, always someone just like them, always in a community just like theirs. The details would be specific enough to feel real, but vague enough to be unverifiable. Then came the offer of a security assessment, presented not as a service, but as a professional courtesy. His voice would lower conspiratorially, as he explained how his superiors didn't usually approve of such thorough investigations, but he believed in going above and beyond to protect vulnerable citizens. The pressure point was always the same: fear masked as favor, threat disguised as thoughtfulness. Who would dare refuse such kindness? Who would risk becoming the next cautionary tale in his collection of tragedies? More importantly, who would question an officer so dedicated to their safety that he would spend time checking every window latch, every door lock, every hiding place where valuables might be stored? Morrison had refined his performance through countless rehearsals, each word calibrated for maximum impact. Even his business card, which he never left behind, was a prop in his theater of deception. Shown but never surrendered, present but untraceable. The February twilight came early to Pine Valley Estates, shadows stretching across snow-packed streets by 4 o'clock. Margaret's unease grew with the darkness as she documented Morrison's methodical progress through her community. The winter had already claimed 2 lives this season, Mrs. Patterson's heart giving out while shoveling, Mr. Rodriguez slipping on black ice. The cold made them all vulnerable, trapped inside their homes like fish in a frozen pond. From her vantage point, she logged Morrison's visits with growing concern. 15 minutes at the Chen residence, 22 at the Robertsons, 18 at the Goldsteins. Each home he entered underwent subtle but significant changes, like wounds festering beneath bandages. The first clear warning came during her weekly grocery assistance visit to Eleanor Henderson. The blast of warm air that greeted Margaret carried an unfamiliar scent: chemical, antiseptic, wrong. Eleanor's house, normally maintained with almost compulsive precision, showed signs of invisible disorder. Cabinet doors hung slightly open, their contents rearranged in ways that only a long-time visitor would notice. The silver-framed wedding photo that had guarded Eleanor's mantle for 46 years was conspicuously absent, replaced by a drugstore frame holding a faded duplicate. Eleanor's behavior had shifted too. Her movements were quick and nervous, like a small animal sensing a hawk's shadow. When Margaret inquired about the missing silver frame, Eleanor's explanation came too quickly, too rehearsed. "Just getting it professionally cleaned," she said, her fingers worrying the edge of her cardigan where her wedding ring used to rest. Then in a whisper so soft, Margaret almost missed it, "He said not to tell anyone about the security measures." The pattern repeated across Pine Valley Estates, each home another knot in a noose tightening around their community. Mrs. Chen stopped wearing her jade pendant, a family heirloom that had survived the Cultural Revolution. The Robertsons, who had hosted bridge night every Thursday since Reagan was president, suddenly claimed their game room needed reorganizing. Most disturbing was the change in Rita Sullivan, Margaret's fellow retired librarian and closest friend. Rita, who had never missed their Tuesday coffee dates in 15 years, now communicated only through brief, oddly formal texts. Margaret recorded every detail in her notebook, a habit carried over from decades of tracking library patterns. She noted how residents would glance over their shoulders before retrieving their mail, how conversations would stop when Morrison's car appeared on their quiet streets. Most tellingly, she documented how his vehicle's markings seemed to shift subtly between visits. The emergency lights sometimes higher, sometimes lower. The door decals never quite identical from day to day. Margaret's investigation intensified as winter's grip on Pine Valley Estates tightened. The retirement community's security gate, once a source of comfort, now felt like the bars of a cage, trapping them with a predator. Her son David's voice echoed in her memory, sharing stories from his police academy days about the precise protocols for official vehicles. "Everything's permanent, Mom," he'd explained during his last visit. "Magnetic decals died out with disco." This detail nagged at her consciousness as she observed Morrison's car through her binoculars, watching him adjust something on the vehicle's door before each approach. The winter wind carried sounds in strange ways, and one morning she distinctly heard the soft rip of magnetic material being peeled away. The inconsistencies multiplied like frost patterns on a window. Morrison's badge number, glimpsed briefly during his conversations with neighbors, changed subtly between visits. His patrol patterns, initially random, revealed themselves to be carefully orchestrated. He never approached a house if another officer was in the area, and his visits always occurred when potential witnesses were at their daily activities: bridge club, medical appointments, grocery shopping. A disturbing discovery came while cross-referencing her observations with the community calendar she'd maintained for 15 years. The Robertsons hadn't just canceled bridge night. They'd withdrawn from every social engagement following Morrison's visit. Mrs. Chen's absence from her daily Tai Chi in the community center coincided with Morrison's assessment of her home. Even the usually gregarious Goldsteins had stopped hosting their famous Sunday brunches. Then came the news that chilled Margaret more than the sub-zero temperatures. Rita Sullivan had fallen down her basement stairs the night after Morrison's visit. "Just clumsy?" Rita had texted from the hospital. "Nothing stolen." But Margaret remembered Rita's obsession with proper lighting, how she'd installed motion sensors after her husband's death. Those lights, Rita had proudly told her, would never fail. They had battery backups. The local police station's website listed every active detective, their badge numbers, and their assigned districts. Morrison's name appeared nowhere, but Margaret's librarian instincts led her deeper. She discovered 3 other retirement communities within 50 miles had reported unusual burglary patterns in the past month. Each incident followed a similar sequence: a courteous detective performing security checks, followed by residents reporting missing valuables weeks later, after any evidence had grown cold. The most disturbing pattern emerged from obituaries. In each community Morrison had visited, at least one elderly resident had died in an apparent accident within weeks of his security assessment. The deaths were always ruled accidental: falls, medication mistakes, carbon monoxide from faulty heaters. But Margaret noticed how each victim had something in common. They were all known for being particularly observant. The morning Morrison finally approached Margaret's house, the temperature had dropped to 15 below zero. She had positioned herself strategically, her armchair angled to monitor both the front door and the street beyond through her security camera's display. The cameras were new, a gift from David after her husband passed, though she'd never mentioned them to her neighbors. Rita's text from that morning weighed heavily on her mind. "Don't trust anyone, not even those you think you can. He has friends everywhere." The message had been followed by another. "Sorry, wrong number." But Margaret knew Rita never made such mistakes. Morrison's knock came at precisely 10:15 a.m., matching the schedule she'd documented meticulously. Through her high-definition display, she studied his approach. His breath didn't create vapor in the frigid air. He'd been sitting in a heated car, watching, waiting. The badge was already half-drawn, his practiced smile firmly in place, but tiny details betrayed him. His shoes, despite the slush and salt, were immaculate. No real detective working Minnesota winters kept shoes that clean. When she opened the door, she watched his eyes perform their practiced dance. Face, badge, escape routes, valuables. His pupils dilated slightly at the sight of her silver collection, displayed prominently through the living room window. But there was something else in his gaze now, something that hadn't been there during his other visits. Recognition? Awareness? The micro-expression vanished quickly, replaced by professional concern. But Margaret had caught it. Predators can't fully hide their hunger, especially when they spot potential prey that might fight back. The facade cracked further when she mentioned David. Morrison's recovery was almost perfect. A smooth comment about interdepartmental cooperation, a casual reference to the police academy. But Margaret noticed how his left hand twitched toward his pocket, where a real detective's ID should be, how his weight shifted slightly backward, preparing for a strategic retreat. Most tellingly, she saw how his eyes darted to his car, where magnetic decals waited to be peeled away, transforming a hunter back into shadow. Their entire interaction lasted exactly 4 minutes and 23 seconds. Margaret timed it, just as she'd timed everything else. As Morrison retreated to his car, she noticed one final detail that turned her blood to ice. The business card he'd displayed so confidently bore the same phone number she'd seen in Rita's recent call log, marked with a single word, handler. Margaret's preparation had been methodical, worthy of the predator she now faced. But doubt gnawed at her resolve. Rita's cryptic warning suggested Morrison had connections within the real police force. Even David might unknowingly be feeding information to the wrong people. The stakes had escalated far beyond simple theft. The pattern of convenient accidents in other communities made that clear. As Morrison stood on her doorstep for his initial visit, her security cameras silently uploaded their footage to multiple secure locations. David's police server was just one of many. Her cell phone, hidden beneath a crocheted doily, recorded every word. The silent alarm she'd activated would bring real officers within minutes, assuming Morrison followed his pattern and assuming those officers weren't compromised. She invited him in with the same trembling vulnerability he'd exploited in her neighbors, but beneath her performance lay real fear. The props were carefully placed, strategically positioned jewelry boxes with family heirlooms, a misplaced checkbook visible on her coffee table, the fresh tea service suggesting a lengthy visit. A partially opened desk drawer revealed glimpses of stock certificates, all carefully prepared bait in a trap that might snap shut on the wrong prey. Morrison's smile widened as he stepped across her threshold, his practiced speech about burglary prevention already beginning. His eyes performed their familiar dance around her living room, lingering a fraction too long on her displayed valuables. But this time, she caught him glancing at the family photos on her wall, paying particular attention to pictures of David in his uniform. The predator was assessing not just her wealth, but her connections. The scene played out like a choreographed dance, with Morrison moving through her home with predatory grace. He noted exits, sightlines from neighboring houses, daily delivery schedules. His questions were precise, designed to reveal security systems and routines. Margaret matched him step for step, feeding him carefully selected information, watching his subtle reactions. She mentioned her upcoming doctor's appointment, her weekly bridge game, her valuable silver collection, all lies, all bait. But when he lingered too long examining her medicine cabinet, she realized he was noting more than just routines. What Morrison failed to notice was the trap closing around him, though not the one he might have expected. Every neighbor he'd victimized had provided statements, but not to David. Margaret had contacted retired detectives from other districts, people outside Morrison's suspected sphere of influence. Traffic cameras had captured his car's changing decals, footage now stored on private servers rather than police databases. Most damning of all, Margaret's detailed logs had revealed his pattern across multiple communities, connecting dozens of unsolved burglaries and suspicious deaths. The fatal flaw in Morrison's technique was its very perfection. Real detectives made mistakes, had rough edges, showed the wear of actual police work. His performance was too polished, like a diamond so flawless it could only be fake. As he examined her valuables, Margaret saw his mask slip further. The hunger in his eyes grew sharper, his questions more pointed. He was already planning his return, mentally cataloging her belongings and calculating their worth. But when he casually mentioned knowing her friend Rita, his tone carried a subtle threat that made her grateful for the panic button hidden in her sleeve. Morrison spent exactly 19 minutes in Margaret's house, the same duration she'd documented for other initial visits. As he left, promising to follow up with a written security assessment, she watched him make what she hoped would be his final mistake. His perfect shoes, so carefully maintained, picked up traces from the specially prepared welcome mat. Each step would now leave microscopic evidence, marking his path like breadcrumbs. The question was, who would follow them first, her allies or his? The end came 3 days later, but not as Margaret had planned. Morrison returned during her supposed doctor's appointment, his timing as precise as ever. But he wasn't alone. Through her hidden cameras, Margaret watched a second figure emerge from his car. Rita Sullivan, her arm in a cast, her face a mask of fear. The trap she'd set was now a double-edged sword. The operation shifted instantly. The retired detectives Margaret had stationed nearby couldn't move in without endangering Rita. Morrison had evolved his tactics, using her friend as both hostage and key to bypass any security measures. The predator had indeed sensed her preparation and adapted accordingly. From her concealed position in the garage, Margaret watched through the security feed as Morrison forced Rita to enter first. "Tell her about the accident." His voice came clearly through her hidden microphones. "Tell her how easily things break in winter." Rita's hands shook as she called out, but her eyes darted purposefully around the room, noting the subtle signals Margaret had prepared. The evidence recovered later from Morrison's home revealed the true scope of his operation. Dozens of false badges, police uniforms from multiple jurisdictions, and a collection of sophisticated lockpicking tools painted a picture of a career predator. His garage contained a workshop for creating fake police decals, complete with high-end printing equipment and magnetic sheets. The trunk of his immaculate car held multiple license plates, each corresponding to different law enforcement agencies across 3 states. Most disturbing were his notebooks, meticulous records of potential victims, their routines, their vulnerabilities. He had transformed elder fraud into an art form, his methodology so refined that most victims never realized they'd been targeted until weeks after he'd disappeared. The pages revealed hundreds of detailed entries, medication schedules noting when victims might be disoriented, dates of deceased spouses' passings, indicating emotional vulnerability, careful notes about which residents seemed most trusting of authority figures. A special section was devoted to observers, people like Margaret who needed to be handled differently. The true horror emerged during Morrison's subsequent trial, when the full network was exposed. 3 actual police officers, 2 security company employees, and a hospital administrator had facilitated his operation for years. Their testimony revealed a calculated system of exploitation that had claimed far more than just valuables. Dozens of deaths, previously ruled accidental, were reopened for investigation. Margaret's careful documentation proved crucial, but it was Rita's secret recordings that finally brought down the entire network. Her accident had been staged after she contacted state investigators, allowing her to work as an inside witness. The cast on her arm contained a sophisticated recording device, capturing conversation that implicated Morrison's entire support system. As Morrison and his conspirators were led away in real handcuffs, his perfect mask finally shattered completely. The smile remained, but now it showed teeth, the last glimpse of a predator who had hunted among society's most vulnerable for far too long. In his final moment of freedom, he looked back at Margaret with a predator's recognition of superior prey, realizing too late that he had mistaken practiced patience for weakness. But the most chilling revelation came months later, when Margaret reviewed the case files. Morrison's next target list included dozens more elderly residents marked for his particular brand of predation. Among the detailed notes, she found photos of herself taken long before his official visit, watching through her window, documenting her routines. The hunter had chosen his prey carefully, but had fatally underestimated the quiet strength of those who spend their lives watching and waiting. The next time someone flashes a badge at your door, will you know if it's real? If this story sent chills down your spine, leave a comment below sharing your own encounters with suspicious officials. Have you ever felt something was off about someone claiming authority? Your experience might save someone else from becoming prey. Don't forget to subscribe to the Nightmare Maestro's channel and hit that notification bell. Every week we explore another dark corner of reality that's closer to home than you might think. Share this video with anyone who needs a reminder that sometimes the scariest monsters wear badges instead of masks. Remember, trust your instincts, question authority, stay vigilant,